Have you ever seen the life drain out of a person's face in a single second? Not the way they show it in the movies, with screams and theatrical gestures. It happens quietly. The skin turns gray, like cooling ash, and the eyes turn into two empty glass marbles. We were sitting in courtroom number 4. The air there always smells of old paper and cheap disinfectant. Dominic sat to my right, in his perfect $5,000 Tom Ford suit, his hair flawlessly styled, wearing the expression of a man who had just bought the entire world. He was smiling victoriously at the judge. He was certain that in 5 minutes I would walk out of that room a pauper. But then his lawyer, that old fox Marcus, leaned into his ear. In the dead silence of the courtroom, his whisper sounded like a gunshot. 5 words, just 5 words. You took on the debts. Dominic didn't understand at first. He frowned, asked him to repeat it. And then his jaw slowly began to drop. The pen he had been twiddling in his fingers snapped with a dry crack, staining his flawless cuffs with black ink. I looked at him and felt nothing, only a cold sense of satisfaction. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start from the beginning. From the moment when I still believed that until death do us part was a promise, not a warning. 15 years. That is exactly how long our project called Marriage lasted. We started in 2009. We had nothing but my law degree, his frantic ambitions, and a 1-bedroom apartment where rusty water ran from the tap. I was the brain, while Dominic ran from meeting to meeting, trying to convince investors that he was the next Donald Trump. I spent my nights proofreading his contracts. I corrected his grammar, found loopholes in the tax code, and stitched up the holes in his raw business plans. I was the foundation upon which he built his tower. And while the tower was low, he held my hand tight. We ate cheap noodles and dreamed of the day we'd have a house with floor-to-ceiling windows and a business that would make the city tremble. We built it. Thorne Development became a household name in this city. But along with the growth of the bank account, something else grew. His ego. It swelled like a malignant tumor, crowding out everything human inside him. Dominic is 42 now. He's at that age where men of his type start to believe they are gods, and the women beside them are merely outdated accessories. He smells of expensive sandalwood, the leather of his Bentley, and an endless, suffocating self-assurance. In the last 3 years, he stopped calling me by my name. I became, Claire, dear, where are my cufflinks? Or, Claire, check this report, I don't have time. He looked right through me, the way one looks at a well-polished piece of furniture. I was convenient. I was functional. I knew all his secrets. But he thought I was too loyal, or too stupid, to use them against him. Oh, how wrong he was. Everything changed on an ordinary Tuesday. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment. Thank you. I had prepared dinner, his favorite ribeye with rosemary. I even opened a bottle of wine from the year we closed our first big deal. I wanted to talk. I wanted to tell him that our son Noah missed him, that I missed him. Dominic walked in without taking off his jacket. He didn't even look at the plate. He sat down opposite me, pulled an envelope from his inner pocket, and tossed it carelessly onto the table, right into a puddle of sauce. I want a divorce, Claire, he said. His voice was as casual as if he were ordering a latte at Starbucks. It's time to be honest. We've outgrown each other. Or rather, I've outgrown this stage. I froze with my fork in midair. My heart skipped a beat, then began to thud slowly and heavily, like a funeral bell. Divorce? Dominic, we've lived together for 15 years. Noah just turned 15. Noah will get everything he needs, he interrupted, staring at his phone. But you'll get exactly what you deserve, which is to say, nothing. He finally looked up at me. There wasn't a drop of pity in his eyes, only the cold calculation of a predator. I knew you'd start calculating percentages and shares in the business, Claire. You're our resident lawyer, right? Always so proper. So I took precautions. Over the last 8 months, I've methodically moved all our joint assets into my new offshore accounts you have no access to. The house is held in a trust of which I am the sole beneficiary. Your personal accounts? I emptied them this morning. Technically, it's my money, earned by my business. I felt something die inside me. Not love, that had evaporated long ago. It was the belief that anything sacred remained in the man I had shared a bed and my dreams with. "You cleared out my accounts?" I whispered. "That was the money my grandmother left me, my personal reserve." "Your reserve is now part of my new empire," he smirked, and that smirk was sharper than a knife. "Consider it tuition. You always said there's no room for emotion in business. Well, I've applied your lesson. You have 3 days to pack your things. I don't want to see you here when Sienna gets back." Sienna? I felt the taste of bile in my mouth. My new assistant, though who am I kidding? She's what I need right now. Youth, energy, admiration. And you've become boring, Claire, like an old law code that everyone knows by heart, but no one wants to open. He stood up, straightened his cuffs, and headed for the exit without having touched the food. "The lawyers will send the papers tomorrow. Sign them quietly, and perhaps I'll grant you a small allowance so you don't have to sleep at the train station." The door slammed with a heavy, final sound. I sat there in the silence of the massive, cold house. I looked at my ribeye, which was slowly being coated in white fat. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from rage, pure, concentrated rage that suddenly crystallized into an icy calm. Dominic thought he was a grand master who had just put me in checkmate in 3 moves. He forgot one small detail. I was the one who taught him how to play chess. And while he was moving numbers from account to account, thinking he was robbing me, he didn't notice that for the last 3 years, I had been carefully sawing through the legs of his golden throne. I took a sip of the wine. It was tart and expensive. "You want a war, Dominic?" I said softly into the empty kitchen. "You've got it. You took my money, but you don't realize yet that along with it, you took all my sins and all your debts." I slowly pulled my phone from under a napkin. In my cloud storage, in a folder titled Landscape Design, the documents he didn't even know existed were waiting for their moment. Dominic thought he had thrown me out onto the street. In reality, he had just locked himself in a cage, the key to which had been in my pocket all along. I looked at the calendar. The court date was a few months away, the most important months of my life. 5 words, I thought, remembering the beginning of my story. "Soon you will hear them, darling, and it will be the last sound of your crumbling empire." I began to eat. The steak was already cold, but I didn't care. Revenge is a dish best served exactly that way. The next morning, my house stopped being mine. It turned into a film set for a cheap reality show. She showed up at 10 in the morning. Sienna, 22 years old, endless legs, and lips that seemed to take up half her face. She fluttered into the hallway, radiating something sickly sweet, a mix of vanilla and desperation to appear expensive. She was wearing a designer tracksuit that clung so tightly to her curves, I found myself wondering how she even managed to breathe. "Oh, hi," she flashed her veneers at me, looking at me like I was an old nightstand someone forgot to remove during the move. "Dominic said you're packing already. I've got a few ideas for the living room. This beige is so last century, don't you think? We'll repaint everything in a trendy, cool gray. And these books," she touched the spine of my first edition Dickens with visible disgust, "they just collect dust. Minimalism is in now." I said nothing. I simply watched her pace across my parquet floor in her dirty sneakers, leaving marks on wood I had personally selected in Italy. Sienna was the living embodiment of an Instagram filter, bright, empty, completely artificial. She was exactly the tool I needed. Dominic had always loved shiny toys, never noticing the hollowness inside them. At noon, the heavy artillery arrived. My mother-in-law, Eleanor. She walked in without knocking, as always, dressed in a strict suit the color of dried blood. In her hands she carried neither flowers nor words of comfort. She carried a massive roll of black garbage bags. Claire, she pursed her lips, surveying the chaos in the foyer. I brought containers. There's no point dragging this farewell out. It's bad for Dominic's image. She threw the roll onto the rosewood console. The sound of plastic hitting wood echoed in my head. Eleanor, we lived together for 15 years, I said quietly, continuing to fold my things. I built this house. I raised your grandson. You drew the winning ticket when my son married you, Claire. Eleanor folded her arms. You were a gray little mouse from a law office. He gave you a name, status, these walls. But you made the biggest mistake a woman can make. You became boring. You stopped being a celebration for him. You buried yourself in accounts and spreadsheets, forgetting that a man needs admiration, not audits. It's not enough to simply be there. You must be interesting. Sienna, she gives him what you couldn't. She gives him the feeling of power. I looked at her, at a woman who had spent her entire life tolerating her husband's affairs just to keep the family crest printed on napkins. Power? I smirked, stuffing my favorite cashmere coat into a black bag. More like a sense of impunity. But thank you for the bags, Eleanor. They'll be very useful. All day I packed my life. 15 years of marriage fit into 6 black trash bags. I didn't take furniture. I didn't take the jewelry he had given me for appearances. I took only what was mine in soul: books, old photos of Noah, and my work notebooks. Meanwhile, Sienna was already bossing around workers who were carrying in ridiculous mirrored cabinets. She laughed loudly on the phone, discussing how she would cleanse the aura of the old energy. The final note sounded when I was standing at a gas station 5 kilometers from the house. My old Audi was stuffed with bags to the roof. I inserted my card into the terminal to pay for gas. Declined. I tried again. Card blocked. Contact your bank. Dominic didn't wait 3 days. He cut off oxygen the moment I crossed the threshold. He wanted me to feel every cent of my fall, to stand on my knees begging for scraps. I reached into the glove compartment and took out an old envelope. Inside was $500 in cash. I had hidden it a month ago, anticipating this gesture. His pettiness was so predictable it was almost boring. My new apartment was in an industrial district on the outskirts of the city, a tiny 4th-floor studio with no elevator. The windows faced a brick factory wall, and the hallway smelled like fried onions and dampness. The walls were painted in the same dirty beige Sienna hated so much. I dragged in the last bag, locked the door with 3 bolts, and leaned against it. The room was cold. A single light bulb cast long, crooked shadows. I had no joint accounts, no house, no Mrs. Thorne status. In Dominic and Eleanor's eyes, I was destroyed. I slowly slid down the door onto the floor. The silence was so thick it could be cut with a knife. And suddenly, I started laughing. At first quietly, then louder, until it turned into a rasp. They all believed in their game. Eleanor believed in life lessons. Sienna believed in a new era. Dominic believed he had cleared the accounts. He really had cleared them. He transferred millions of clean money into offshore accounts, thinking he had hidden them from me. But he was so busy playing hide-and-seek that he missed the most important thing. The assets he greedily kept for himself, the shopping centers, the residential developments under construction, his beloved Thorne Development, were no longer gold mines. Over the past 3 years, through complex cross-credit schemes, I had personally turned his business into a giant vacuum for debt. Every cent he had stolen from me was tied to obligations that would explode in a few months. I opened my laptop. The screen lit up my face. "Trendy gray, you say, Sienna?" I whispered, watching the stock graph of his company begin to tremble slowly but surely. Well, gray is an excellent color for a prison cell. For the first time in a long while, I smiled genuinely. My little dump on the outskirts of the city was now the safest place on earth, because legally, I had nothing, which meant that when the bailiffs came knocking on the doors of Thorne Development, they wouldn't find me there. I pulled a thermos of tea out of one of the bags. Life in garbage bags turned out to be surprisingly light. When you lose everything, you finally gain the freedom to do what must be done. The first stage of the plan was complete. Dominic swallowed the bait along with the hook, the line, and the rod. He thought he threw out the trash. He didn't realize he had climbed into the bin himself and slammed the lid shut from the inside. They say the devil is in the details. In my case, the devil was hiding in a folder labeled ___, quote, _0, ___ on his computer desktop. That was exactly 3 years ago. Dominic had flown to Dubai for yet another quote one, which, as I realize now, was just a pretext to parade his latest mistress around on a yacht. He had forgotten to close his laptop in his office. A typical oversight for a man who treats his wife like a piece of furniture. Does a lamp or a rug care about the holding company's accounts receivable? I went into the office just to close the window. A storm was brewing. The scent of his expensive tobacco and heavy leather chair always made me feel a bit dizzy. But that evening, the air felt electric. The laptop screen flickered when I accidentally bumped the mouse. I didn't intend to spy, truly, but I am a lawyer. My brain is trained to spot anomalies in datasets faster than an antivirus catches a worm. The first thing I saw was a bank statement he'd forgotten to minimize. The balance was strange, far too low for a company of his stature. I sat in his chair. The cold leather touched my thighs. I didn't leave that office for the next 4 hours. The storm outside roared, lightning slashed the sky, and I slowly descended into the hell Dominic had built with his own hands. What the city saw as the quote, __2 was in reality a rotting corpse dressed up in a tuxedo. Dominic wasn't just taking risks, he was sick. He was blowing millions in private online casinos where the minimum bet started at $50,000. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. His pride dealt the killing blow. He had poured nearly 40% of the company's liquid assets into Genesis X, a shady crypto Ponzi scheme that promised the world but imploded a week before my discovery. But the worst part was something else. Our home, our family sanctuary where Noah grew up, had been mortgaged 3 times. 3 times. Dominic took out loans against our property to cover losses from previous loans. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, but on the scale of a single family. The business was drowning in lawsuits from suppliers, which he froze by promising them future contracts. He was sucking the lifeblood out of everything he could reach. That evening I realized Dominic wasn't a successful developer. He was a bankrupt man desperately trying to make it to the Canadian border before the house of cards collapsed. I sat in the dark when the screen went black. My first instinct was to scream, to wake Noah, pack our bags, and run, to file for divorce the very next morning. But then I froze. As a lawyer, I knew, if I filed for divorce now, during the division of assets, all those toxic debts would become half mine. Under our state law, marital debts are split as fairly as income. Dominic would have dragged me to the bottom with him. I would have been left with a 15-year-old son, penniless, facing million-dollar lawsuits from banks. And so I made a decision. If he wanted to play the quote, _5 I would become his chief architect. When Dominic returned from Dubai, I didn't make a scene. On the contrary, I brought him his favorite whiskey, sat at his feet, and said, "Darling, I've noticed you've been very tense lately. I took a look at the accounts." I paused, savoring the way he choked on his drink. "And I realized we have some temporary tax issues. I want to help. I'm a lawyer, after all. I know how to optimize the business structure." He looked at me with suspicion, but his ego quickly won out. He decided I was his loyal, gray mouse, willing to do anything to maintain her status quo. "Yes, Claire," he exhaled, wiping his lips. "Times are tough right now. It would be good if you looked over the paperwork." And look over them I did. Oh, how I did. The next 2.5 years were my personal masterpiece of legal acrobatics. Every time Dominic needed to refinance, I helped him draft the documents. I structured the contracts so that new loans were issued not to the holding company, but to his personal shell companies, where he was the sole founder and personal guarantor. I whispered to him, "Dominic, this is how we protect our joint assets from the company's creditors." He would nod and sign without reading the fine print. He was lazy. It was more important to him that his credit limits didn't drop, so he could keep buying Sienna necklaces from Cartier. I methodically turned him into the _13_. I scrubbed my name from every joint liability. It was surgical work. I was separating my financial destiny from his, the way you excise gangrenous tissue. But there was one more task: Noah. I couldn't let my son be left with nothing because of his father's madness. I started acting behind Dominic's back, using my old connections in legal circles and my grandmother's inheritance, the very money he would later boastfully consider his. I set up a protected trust fund in a jurisdiction his dirty hands couldn't reach. Every month, I funneled out small amounts under the guise of, quote, 15 to third-party firms. I billed it as landscaping, legal expertise, marketing research. Dominic didn't even look at the receipts. 5,000 here, 7,000 there. To him, it was pocket change. To me, it was the foundation for my son's future life. I watched him grow more arrogant by the day. He thought he was outsmarting the system and that I was just a useful appendage. He didn't notice that with every signed paper, his debt noose was tightening. By the time of that ill-fated dinner when he announced the divorce, I had already finished my work. All the assets he had, quote, 16 in the last 8 months, were actually encumbered with such liabilities that they were worth less than the paper the statements were printed on. He thought he had wiped my accounts clean. He didn't know those accounts were just bait, a small sacrifice to make him taste victory and lower his guard. I looked at him that evening, at his groomed face, his confidence in his own infallibility, and I could barely suppress a smile. You wanted it all, Dominic, I thought. You'll get it. Every cent of debt, every lawsuit, and every mortgaged brick of this house. You wanted to be king? Well, welcome to your kingdom, a kingdom of empty pockets. I closed my eyes, remembering the sound of the rain that night 3 years ago. That rain washed away my loyalty. And now it was time to wash away his pride. In chess, there's a concept called a gambit. You sacrifice a piece to gain a positional advantage. But in my life, that piece turned out to be Vanessa, my best friend, the maid of honor at our wedding, and the person I trusted with the keys to my house and my soul. I learned about her betrayal a week after I moved out. Vanessa dropped by my new hovel, bringing a bottle of cheap wine and a sympathetic grimace. She scanned the peeling walls with an expression as if she were afraid she'd catch poverty like a disease. "Oh, Claire, honey," she wailed, perching on the edge of my only chair. "How could he? It's barbaric. You did everything for him." She smelled of Portrait of a Lady by Frederick Malle. It was my favorite perfume. I had given her that very bottle for her birthday. But that evening, there was another scent coming from her, faint yet deafening to me. The scent of cedar and expensive tobacco, the scent of Dominic's cologne. I didn't let it show. My legal brain instantly switched into analysis mode. I remembered how, over the last 6 months, Vanessa always seemed to be around whenever Dominic and I fought. How she, quote 23, quote, dropped by his office to, quote 24, quote, and then I saw it. As she reached for her glass, a gold keychain slid out of her purse, the same one Dominic had bought in a private boutique in Paris last month. He'd told me it was a, quote 25. In that moment, I wanted to throw the wine in her face. But I took a deep breath. A friend's betrayal is painful, but in my situation, it was a gift from God. I needed a channel to Dominic, a channel he would trust implicitly, a spy in my bed, or rather, in his. "Vanessa," I said, covering my eyes to mimic a tremor in my voice, "I can't do this anymore. I'm broken. He won." "Oh, don't say that," she whispered, touching my shoulder. I felt her fingers tighten like a predator's. I sobbed. My college acting classes finally paid off. I saw the spark of greed in her eyes. She could barely stop herself from reaching for her phone right then and there. Quote 33. I said, letting my hair fall to hide my face. She left 10 minutes later, citing some. I stood by the window and watched her car pull away. I knew where she was going. To him, to his house, to whisper in his ear that his wife was finally crushed and ready to surrender for a pittance. Dominic took the bait so hard it came out the other side. For the next 2 weeks, he acted like a conquering emperor. With Vanessa confirming my quote, 36 he completely lost his guard. Why hide expenses when the enemy has already waved the white flag? Why save money when, tomorrow, you'll legally secure every asset without giving your ex-wife a single cent? He started spending. It was a mad, feverish spree with money he didn't actually have. He bought a new Patek Philippe for $22,000. I found out through Sienna's Instagram. She posted a photo of their romantic breakfast, his hand with the new watch resting carelessly on the table. A reward for the champion, the caption read. I looked at that photo and smiled. I knew those watches were bought through an overdraft on one of his personal accounts, an account I had helped him open a year ago. Every new accessory, every private jet flight with Sienna that weekend, it all went into the pile of his personal debt. He was bloating his company's debt load, shifting funds into shell accounts to, quote, 40 them from the divorce, not realizing he was just stuffing his pockets with dynamite. His ego became his blind spot. He even stopped showing up to meetings with the lawyers, sending assistants instead. He was certain Claire, in her pathetic apartment on the outskirts, was just waiting to sign the papers and get her measly $30,000. But in this game, there was one victim whose pain I felt in my heart, Noah. My son spent the weekends with his father. Dominic tried to buy his loyalty the same way he bought Sienna's attention. He gave Noah the latest gaming rig, promised him a car for his 16th birthday, took him to the most expensive restaurants. But Noah is my son. He has my analytical mind and the same sharp eye. One evening, he came to see me. He sat on my worn-out sofa, looked around the empty room, and stayed silent for a long time. Quote 41, he said softly. Quote 42. Quote 43. I tried to keep my voice neutral. Quote 44. Noah shook his head. Quote 45. I felt something crack inside me. My records, the original pressing of Joni Mitchell's, quote 46, that I'd spent 3 years tracking down. Quote 47. Noah continued, looking me dead in the eye. Quote 48. I walked over and hugged him. He was already taller than me, my little grown man. Quote 49. Quote 50. He pulled back, searching my face. In his eyes, I saw a flash of the same cold fire that lived in me. Quote 51, I whispered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about Vanessa, probably drinking wine in my living room, about Dominic, admiring his new watch, and about Sienna, painting my walls gray. They all thought I was trash they'd kicked to the curb. They didn't understand that I was the foundation. And when you rip the foundation out from under a building to replace it with cheap scenery, the whole structure begins to tilt. Tomorrow was the first mediation. The play was beginning, and I was ready to play my part to the end. I thought, staring at the brick factory wall outside my window, a glass and steel skyscraper in the city center, the 22nd floor. The air in that boardroom was worth more than everything I was wearing that day. I had specifically chosen an old, mass-market knit dress with slightly stretched elbows and skipped my makeup. My eyes looked puffy, thanks to a sleepless night and a few drops of saline solution. I entered the room, deliberately tripping over the edge of the rug. Dominic was already there. He sat at the head of a massive, polished mahogany table, looking like a predator that had just cornered its prey and was now deciding which side to start eating first. He was wearing a midnight blue suit, and those Patek Philippe watches, the ones bought with money he didn't have, glinted on his wrist. Next to him sat Marcus, a lawyer whose conscience was as slick and impenetrable as his bald head. On my side sat my old acquaintance, Stephen. I knew Stephen would play his part perfectly. He looked slightly flustered, constantly adjusting his tie to create the illusion that we didn't stand a chance. Quote 5-4. Dominic didn't even stand up. He just nodded with such condescending majesty that I nearly gagged. I'm glad you decided not to drag out this farce. Let's finish this today. Sienna booked a table at Le Bernardin for 8, and I don't want to be late. I lowered my head, hiding my gaze. My hands, resting on my knees, were trembling slightly. It was the absolute truth. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, but he took it for fear. I just want it to end, Dominic, I whispered. I can't live like this anymore. Noah is suffering. I'm living in a place where I can hear rats scratching in the walls at night. Marcus cleared his throat and pushed a thick folder toward us. So, the terms of our offer remain the same. Mr. Thorne retains 100% of the shares in Thorne Development, the family residence, and all offshore accounts. In exchange, he offers you, he checked the papers, a lump sum payment of $30,000 and coverage of your son's tuition for the coming year. This is extremely generous, considering the company's assets were built through Mr. Thorne's personal efforts. Personal efforts? Stephen, my lawyer, spoke up, trying to sound indignant. Maya Klientka was the company's legal consultant for 15 years. She is entitled to whatever I decide to give her. Dominic slammed his palm on the table. The sound was like a gunshot. Claire knew what she was getting into when she stopped caring about the business and turned into a houseplant. If we go to court, I'll prove she hasn't been involved in management for the last 3 years, and then she'll get nothing at all. I let out a soft sob. Dominic, please, at least the house. Where will Noah and I live? My new family will live in that house, he snapped. It's time you learned some responsibility, Claire. You were always too soft. Life is a struggle. I slowly raised my eyes. They were filled with tears, but behind that veil I saw Marcus nervously flipping through the pages. He knew there was one tiny nuance in the documents that we had prepared. Fine, I said, swallowing hard. I'll sign, but I have one condition, just one small addition to the contract. Marcus tensed. Dominic rolled his eyes. God, Claire, what now? Do you want the silver spoons? No, I wiped my cheek. I want my grandmother's inheritance, those $300,000 that I put into the joint budget 2 years ago. And I hesitated, looking at Stephen. Stephen says that if I am waiving all assets, I must be fully released from any financial obligations related to the business. We've drafted an addendum on the separation of liability. Stephen pulled 3 sheets of paper from his briefcase. It's standard procedure in a total waiver of shares, he explained to Marcus. Mr. Thorne takes 100% of the assets, but in return, he assumes 100% of the liabilities. Any debts, loans, lawsuits, or obligations of Thorne Development and its related entities will now be his sole personal responsibility. Claire Thorne leaves the marriage legally clean. Marcus quickly scanned the text. A moment of doubt crossed his face. He knew Thorne Development had debts. All companies do. But he didn't know their true volume. He looked at Dominic. Marcus whispered. Dominic smirked. He leaned toward me, and I smelled his coffee and mint gum. Quote 77. He laughed. Quote 78. Quote 79. I replied softly. Quote 80. Marcus made one last attempt. Quote 81. Silence hung in the room. My heart stopped. If they performed an audit now, everything would collapse. They would see the cross-collateralized loans. They would see the debt nooses I had spent 3 years braiding. Dominic turned sharply to his lawyer. His face was flushed with anger. Quote 82. Quote 83. Quote 84. Dominic snatched the pen from him. Quote 85. He grabbed the document. His hand moved fast, confident. The scratch of the Mont Blanc pen across the thick paper sounded like heavenly music to me. The first signature, the second, the third. He signed the underscore, quote, underscore, 86, underscore. He legally confirmed that he, Dominic Thorne, was taking on all the debt, including the millions I had forced him to personally guarantee using his underscore, quote, underscore, 87, underscore as collateral. When he finished, he tossed the pen aside and looked at me with triumph. Quote 88. I picked up my copy of the documents. My hands were no longer shaking. I slowly tucked them into my old bag. Quote 89, I said. There was no longer a tremor in my voice. It was steady and cold, like ice in the Arctic Ocean. Quote 90. Quote 91. He frowned, his confidence wavering for a second. Quote 92. I stood up. Quote 93. I walked out of the boardroom without looking back. Stephen followed me. As soon as the elevator doors closed, he wiped the sweat from his forehead. I looked at my reflection in the mirrored wall of the elevator. I stepped out onto the sun-drenched street and for the first time in 15 years took a full, deep breath. The air no longer smelled of Dominic. It smelled of freedom. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a message from Noah, quote 97. I quickly typed a reply, quote 98. Dominic thought he was the king who had taken all the pieces on the board. He didn't notice that the board itself was already soaked in gasoline, and I had just dropped a match in the center. Now, all I had to do was step back to a safe distance and watch his perfect world burn. Courtroom number 4, the very place where I began my story. The circle had closed. A heavy, almost tangible silence hung in the air. Judge Henderson, a man with a face carved from old oak, slowly turned the pages of our agreement. In that silence, the rustle of paper sounded like the roar of a landslide. Dominic sat back in his chair. He looked like a man attending a coronation, his own. Every now and then he adjusted his cuffs, casting glances at me full of lazy contempt. Beside him, Marcus made notes in a legal pad with an air of absolute superiority. Now then, Judge Henderson looked up, peering at me over his glasses. Mrs. Thorne, I have carefully reviewed the mediation documents. Do you realize that according to this agreement, you are waiving all claims to Thorne Development? You are waiving your rights to the family residence and all accounts listed in Appendix A in exchange for, he frowned, $30,000 and your personal fund? Yes, Your Honor. My voice was quiet but firm. I just want to end this chapter of my life. You understand that the difference in asset value is colossal? The judge was clearly trying to show some sympathy. Mr. Thorne takes the empire and you take almost nothing. Dominic couldn't help himself. He let out a short, dry chuckle. Quote 107, the judge snapped. He looked at me again. Quote 110. Dominic gave Marcus a smug nod. See how scared she is, he seemed to say. She's so afraid of credit card debt that she gave me a multi-million-dollar house for it. And that was the moment Marcus, the experienced, cold-blooded Marcus, decided to take one last look, purely as a formality, at the appendix to the addendum, that same list of quota 1 that he and Dominic had ignored during mediation, dismissing it as boring, bureaucratic red tape. I saw it happen in slow motion. Marcus turned the page. His eyes darted across the lines. He frowned. Then he froze. The hand holding his expensive pen began to tremble. He turned another page, then another. The color began to drain from his face. First, his lips turned white, then his cheeks turned a sickly ashen gray. He suddenly doubled over as if he'd been punched in the gut and began feverishly searching for something on his laptop. Dominic noticed. His smile began to slowly slide away. Quote, 112, he whispered. Marcus didn't answer. He sat staring at the documents, and I saw a bead of sweat roll down his temple. Then he leaned toward Dominic. Those 5 specific words. You took on the debts. What? Dominic frowned, his voice cracking into a rasp. What are you talking about? It's just current loans. No, Dominic, I said, standing up. My voice now rang out clear as a bell. They aren't current loans. Judge Henderson raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Thorne? Your Honor. I took a step forward, and in that moment, I was no longer a broken woman in a stretched-out dress. I was a lawyer, the same lawyer who had built this business for 15 years. My husband was in such a hurry to grab the assets that he forgot to study the nature of those assets. I placed a blue folder on the table before the judge. Marcus had a copy of the same folder. In the appendix to the addendum that Mr. Thorne signed yesterday, the personal guarantees for Thorne Development's credit lines are listed. Specifically, the house he was so eager to keep has been mortgaged 3 times. The total debt to the banks exceeds the market value of the residence by $2 million. Dominic jumped up, his face turning a deep crimson. "That's a lie. The house is clear." "The house was clear until you signed the documents for Genesis X, Dominic. Do you remember those papers I gave you to sign last year? Technical tax documents, as I called them?" I smiled at him, for the first time in a long time, a genuine and cold smile. "You signed a personal guarantee for all the losses of that crypto fund, and you transferred those losses to the balance sheet of your personal shell company, the one you officially took for yourself yesterday, along with the rest of your business." Marcus finally found his voice, though it sounded more like a death rattle. "Your Honor, there are tax liens listed here for $4 million, penalties for offshore fraud in Belize." "Oh yes," I nodded. "The very offshores Dominic worked so hard to hide from me. You see, Dominic, when you were moving money there, you used schemes that I suggested to you myself. But I forgot to mention that those schemes were declared illegal 2 years ago. Now the IRS considers those transfers attempted tax evasion. And guess who is the sole beneficiary and defendant for those companies, according to the contract you just finalized?" Dominic stared at me, and realization finally reflected in his eyes. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a snare. He had greedily grabbed everything that glittered, not realizing they were fishhooks. "Quote 129, he roared, lunging toward the table. Quote 130, the crack of the judge's gavel made him flinch. Quote 131, Henderson's voice was icy. Quote 132. Quote 133. Dominic cried out. His voice turned thin, almost childlike. I said, adjusting my hair. I looked at Marcus. He simply covered his face with his hands. He understood. Legally, it was flawless. Dominic had voluntarily, with a greedy glint in his eyes, swallowed the poison I had spent years wrapping in gold foil. Quote 137. I continued calmly. Quote 138. Judge Henderson looked once more at Dominic, who was now just sitting there, staring into space. His perfect suit suddenly seemed too big for him. His face had taken on that exact shade of gray I had mentioned at the very beginning. Quote 139, the judge declared. Quote 140. The strike of the gavel sounded like a mercy killing. I slowly gathered my papers. Dominic was still sitting motionless. As I passed him, he grabbed my arm. His fingers were cold. Quote 141, he whispered. Quote 142. I leaned down to his ear so that only he could hear my whisper. The scent of his cologne no longer intimidated me. Quote 143. I pulled my arm away. Quote 144. I walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Stephen was waiting for me in the hallway. He silently handed me my coat. Quote 145. Quote 146. I put on the coat and looked at my hands. They were steady. Quote 147. I stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The sun shone brightly, blinding after the gloom of the courtroom. I took out my phone and dialed Noah's number. Underscore, quote, underscore, 148, underscore. I walked down the stairs feeling the weight of the last 15 years shed from my shoulders with every step, like old, useless skin. Ahead of me was the unknown, but it was my unknown. No debt, no lies, and no Dominic. I looked at my reflection in a shop window. There stood a woman. She was alone. She had only $30,000 in her pocket and a ruined empire behind her. But she was smiling, because she knew the most valuable thing she had wasn't money. It was her mind, her freedom, and a clean future for her son. And that was worth far more than any Bentley. The collapse of the Thorne Empire was more than just loud. It was cinematic. You know how they demolish old buildings? one precise explosion at the foundation, and the massive structure of concrete and steel simply folds inward, turning into a cloud of dust. Sienna disappeared a week after the court hearing. She wasn't the type of woman to stay, especially when they involved frozen accounts and an asset seizure. Word is she left with some hotel chain heir, taking everything that wasn't bolted to the floor, including those Patek Philippe watches Dominic had so carelessly left on the nightstand. The house she had so meticulously repainted in trendy gray was confiscated for debt. I saw the photos in the local paper. On the lawn where I once planted roses, an ugly yellow bank-owned sign now stood. Ironically, the gray walls actually suited the house. It had become a lifeless tomb for his failed ambitions. Eleanor called me 38 times. I counted. At first, they were angry messages about how ungrateful I was. Then the tone shifted to a pathetic plea. "Claire, darling, Dominic has nowhere to live. The banks even took my car. You wouldn't let your husband's mother end up on the street, would you?" I looked at my phone screen while sipping a cool lemonade on my new terrace. I didn't feel hatred. I felt completion. I didn't pick up. Some life lessons are very expensive, and it was time for Eleanor to pay her own bill. She always told me I should be interesting. Well, watching me silently build my life without them must be the most interesting show she's ever seen. Noah and I moved to a small town on the coast. I bought an old house with a huge garden, not a flashy mansion, but a place with a soul, smelling of salt and old wood. The money from the trust fund I had so carefully filled for 3 years was enough to ensure Noah got the best education and to give me the chance to never return to corporate law. I opened a small landscape design bureau. Now I create gardens. I no longer build empires out of fake promises. I plant trees that will grow for decades. My office now smells of wet earth, lavender, and hope. Noah has changed. There is no longer that anxious shadow of his father's temper in his eyes. He helps me in the garden, and sometimes I see the boy he was before Dominic tried to turn him into a miniature version of himself. We talk a lot about honesty, the value of hard work, and how real strength isn't the number of zeros in an account, but the ability to remain human when everything is taken from you. 6 months passed. Life flowed on, calm and transparent as a mountain stream, until one evening, as the sun began to sink into the ocean, there was a knock at my door. The knock was hesitant, ragged. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Dominic was standing there, or rather, what was left of him. He was wearing some cheap jacket with the collar turned up, trying to shield himself from the sea breeze. His face, once groomed and powerful, had hollowed out. His stubble was gray, and the fire was gone from his eyes. There was only that same emptiness I had seen in the courtroom. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, watching him through the lens of the peephole. He looked like a ghost from a past life who had lost his way and accidentally stumbled into my world. "Claire," his voice was barely audible through the oak door. "Claire, I know you're in there, please. I have nowhere else to go. Marcus is suing me for unpaid fees. My mother is living in my sister's basement. I made a mistake. You were right about everything. Let's start over. I realize it all now. You have money. I know about the trust. Help me get back on my feet and we'll be great again." He was still talking about empires. Even now, standing on my porch practically a beggar, he was thinking about how to get back on top at my expense. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for an investment. I walked away from the door and into the kitchen. On the table sat a bowl of my favorite ice cream, salted caramel. I slowly took a full spoonful. The cold sweetness burned my tongue. The knock came again, more insistent. _quote_160_. I swallowed the ice cream and looked at my hands. There was no longer a heavy diamond wedding ring on them, the one he'd given me to quote 161. Now my fingers were stained with dirt. I had spent the day replanting hydrangeas, and that dirt felt cleaner to me than all the gold of Thorne Development. Quote 162, I said quietly to the empty kitchen, knowing he couldn't hear me. You're just a man who signed some papers. I turned off the light in the hallway. Through the window, I saw him stand on the porch for a few more minutes with his head down. Then he turned and trudged slowly toward the gate. His shadow was long and awkward in the glow of the garden lights. I didn't feel triumph. Revenge is a strange thing. In the movies, it seems like a bright flash, but in reality, it's just silence. It's when the voice of the person who tried to destroy you no longer causes even a slight increase in your heart rate. I finished my ice cream, washed the bowl, and went upstairs. I looked in on Noah. He was asleep, arms spread wide, with sketches for his own project on his desk. He wants to be an architect, but he wants to build bridges, not shopping centers. I went to the window and looked out at the ocean. Dominic thought he had wiped my accounts. He thought he had stripped me of a future. But the truth is, he gave me the greatest gift of my life. He forced me to remember who I am. Patience is the most expensive currency, and I spent it wisely. I waited 3 years. I endured humiliations. I played the role of the weak woman, all to end up with the one thing you can't buy for any amount of money: freedom. I lay down in my bed, which smelled of fresh cotton and the wind. Tomorrow, I have to finish a garden project for a young family. They want it to be full of light, with a place for their children to play. And I know exactly how to do it. After all, I'm a master of foundations now. Only this time, they're real. I closed my eyes and fell asleep. No nightmares, no fear, no Dominic. The business plan of my life had finally balanced, down to the last cent.